Well, shalom, my friends, and welcome to our series of Bible studies on the book of Genesis. And I must confess to you that I'm a little bit sad about the video today because this one's going to be chapter 50. It's the last chapter of the book of Genesis. And Genesis is one of my favorite books of the Bible, and I have just so enjoyed making these videos and sharing them with you. And I usually don't talk about my YouTube channel, but I've gotten relatively a lot of views on these videos. Most of my videos don't get very many views, but I've gotten quite a few views on these and some really beneficial and comments from people who have watched the videos. So I'm just thrilled about that. But yeah, we'll be doing chapter 50 today, and we will go through the preliminary material of my PowerPoint here. And as I usually do in this video series, for those of you who don't want to go through the preliminary material, the background material, and so forth, I just encourage you to fast forward through the video until you come to the Bible software stuff, and then we will catch up with you when we get to that point. So Genesis chapter 50. Throughout a lot of this series, I've been advertising a relatively new book that I have had published. It's called Nazarene Essene Theology. And I categorize it as a systematic theology, basically of the Second Temple era sect of the Nazarenes and the Essenes. This is the group that produced the Dead Sea Scrolls. It is also the group, in my humble opinion, that produced the Christian church. At the very beginning of the Christian church, it wasn't even called Christian. It was called the Notzrim, the Nazarenes. Jesus in the Bible is called a Nazarene, and his followers were called Nazarenes. Christian is kind of a Greek term that came along a bit later in the book of Acts. But the reason I'm recommending this book to you is that there is a lot of material in this that is drawn from the book of Genesis, and it's all foundational stuff. So I encourage you to get this book, not only for the purposes of kind of augmenting this video series, but also for further studies throughout the Bible. I think this might be helpful for you. So this will be my last advertisement of this book, at least in this series. And all of my books are available on Amazon. That's the best place to get them. We have been using a dispensational chart by Alfred Eade, the theologian and the artist who put these Bible charts together. It is a family publishing company that has continued to make these books available to the public for use in Bible studies and so forth. And it's probably worthwhile my mentioning to you that I have received permission from the publishing company to use these charts in my teaching. So much appreciation for that. These books of charts, if you'd like a hard copy of them, are also available from Amazon and eBay and places like that. If you would like to get it direct from the publisher, I think at a very reasonable price. The publishing company is called Oak Knoll, one word, O-A-K, K-N-O-L-L. I think there are two Ks, not sure. It might be two words, Oak Knoll Publishing Company. And if you go to their website, you'll recognize these charts right away. This particular chart is the, what is it, the fifth in the series of many that cover the major dispensations or historical periods or eras, ages of Bible history. This one's called the Age of Promise because the promises that God made to the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and then all of Jacob's sons, which would become the nation of Israel, are really foundational to the whole biblical story. And of course, the Abrahamic promise or covenant, as it's called, involves land, the promised land. It involves descendants for the family which Abraham would produce. All the various generations are promised offspring that it would eventually be sizable enough to be considered a nation. On this chart is in the other charts as well in this series is what I'm calling the red ribbon of redemption or salvation. And it goes through the various generations of the patriarchs. Avram, whose name is changed to Abraham, Yitzhak, Yaakov, whose name is changed to Israel. And then it goes through Judah, because the Messiah is going to come from the tribe of Judah. Judah is the tribe that would produce the kings, and Yeshua is King of Kings and Lord of Lords, as well as being our Redeemer and our rabbi, if you will, our teacher. And then the red ribbon continues through the days of the Exodus. Now, because we're in the book of Genesis, we're not going to be talking about the Exodus, but we will talk for a few minutes about the genealogy of Moses, because we're looking at these 4 generations, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and then the 12 sons of Jacob. But we also want to look, excuse me, we also want to look at the generations of their descendants that spent time in the land of Egypt. If you would ask most people how many years the Israelites spent in Egypt, most people would say 400 years based on a Bible verse. But one of those Bible verses indicates that the 400 years was not only the time spent in Egypt, but also the time spent in Canaan. They were strangers in Canaan, owned very little property at all. Really, the only property that was possessed by the patriarchal generations was a burial plot in Hebron, which will come up in our discussions today. So I've got a slide in the PowerPoint that will look at the generations of Moses that led up to Moses. And if you wanted to calculate the years that the patriarchs spent in Egypt, it would be about 215 years. Excuse me. And there are a lot of passages in the Bible that address this time that was spent in Egypt. And you really have to look at all of them and kind of put the whole counsel of God together to get a proper, correct genealogy. One of the ways we know that it wasn't 400 years is because Paul says in Galatians that from the time of the Abrahamic promise to the establishment of the Old Covenant and the Law of Moses was 430 years, and that just doesn't leave enough time for all of these generations to be produced. So the 430 years includes the time from Abraham, time spent in Canaan. And really, the Masoretic text, our Hebrew Old Testament text, is a little misleading on this. The Septuagint, which is a Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament, is actually clearer about that. It adds the term Canaan as spending time in Canaan and in Egypt. So that's a little controversial, but we'll continue on here. This is the map of what would become the 12 tribes of Israel. And I used this map in the last maybe couple of studies to show you how much ground the descendants of Joseph's sons and the 2 tribes, double portion that Joseph received in the inheritance. We have here on the east side of the Jordan River runs from the Sea of Galilee to the Dead Sea. And here on the east side, we have east Manasseh. And over on the other side, the west side, we have West Manasseh, which is a huge parcel of ground. But then we also have the other son, Ephraim. His inheritance is here. So you can see by these pieces of real estate that Joseph's descendants received a great big portion of the inheritance. Like I say, a double inheritance. Today we will be talking about the plot of ground that Abraham purchased from Ephron the Hittite, I believe it was. And it was in a place called Machpelah, which in modern times is called Hebron. Hebron is a very ancient city, so Hebron probably had that name at the time of Genesis. But the cave of Machpelah was probably like on the outskirts of town. And I've got a little Star of David here to highlight the location of Hebron. And yeah, we'll talk about burials and stuff like that when we get to the text. Here's the genealogy of Moses, and we start with the generations before Moses, starting with Abraham, Yitzhak, and Yaakov. Then we have Levi, which is the first generation. It's Levi, Yehuda, and the 10 other patriarchs. So that's the 12 tribes. And the first generation to count in those, I guess. This is the generation of Joseph, and he began his personal sojourn in Egypt, begins the 4 generations. So Moses is from the tribe of Levi, which would be the priestly tribe. The first generation is Levi, then his son Kohat is the second generation. Then Amram, who married Yocheved, are the parents of Moshe. And then we have Moshe marrying Zipporah and producing Gershom and Eleazar. But these are the 4 generations that the Bible is talking about. And again, let me emphasize that the time spent in Egypt by these 4 generations is not 400 years, but it's about 215 years. So that brings us to the end of our PowerPoint, our background material. Let's go ahead to our text for today and see what this last chapter of Genesis has in store for us. I'm going to go back 1 verse into the 49th chapter of Genesis, just to bring us up to date. Because in the last several chapters of Genesis, Jacob, the father of these 12 sons, is blessing his descendants. And this blessing is greatly significant. It's prophetic. In chapter 48, he blesses the sons of Joseph and makes them 2 tribes, where every other tribe is only 1 tribe. And you saw how much ground they inherited in the promised land when we went through the preliminary material. So at the end of chapter 49, Jacob has blessed all of the other sons, which would become tribes. And when he had finished commanding his sons, and the thing that he commanded them in chapter 49 was that he did not want to be buried permanently in Egypt. God had promised him and his ancestors the promised land, and that's where he wanted to be buried. That's where Abraham was buried and Sarah was buried. That's where Isaac and Rebekah, I believe, were buried. Jacob's wife, Rachel, was buried in what would later become the land of Israel, but not in Hebron. She was buried close to Bethlehem in Ephratah. So after Jacob had finished commanding his sons concerning his final arrangements, his burial arrangements, and so forth, the Bible tells us that he drew up his feet into the bed and breathed his last and was gathered to his people, which is a biblical euphemism for saying he died. He died physically. His body, of course, was left behind, but his soul and spirit came out of that body and went to the place that God had prepared for them. A few lessons back, We went into some great detail about Sheol in the Bible, which is usually translated hell. It is the place of life after death for both believers and unbelievers in the Old Testament era. And it is such until the time of Yeshua, when after his death on the cross, the spirit and soul of Yeshua came out of his physical body and descended into hell. The Apostles' Creed talks about he descended into hell. And he did that to liberate the believers who were there and take them to their new home, their kind of eternal home in the Father's house with many mansions. So now when believers die, they don't go to Sheol, they go to what is called the third heaven or paradise, the place where God lives, and in the words of Jesus, the Father's house with many mansions, which is a description that I absolutely love. So then Yosef fell on his father's face and wept over him and kissed him. And Yosef commanded his servants, the physicians, to embalm his father. The word physician is a word in Hebrew, which is kind of the Hebrew word for a doctor, a rophe. I understand that the Egyptians were very well advanced in the technology of medicine. They were skilled surgeons. They were very skilled in herbal remedies, medicines, if you will, and so forth. So Joseph commanded his servants, the physicians. So these were the doctors whose job it was to care for Joseph, whom you'll remember was the second most powerful person in Egypt, second only to the Pharaoh. And he commanded the physicians to embalm his father. Hanot is the Hebrew word for that. The Egyptians may have had a different word for it, but the Bible uses this term Hanot. And the commentary from the Dake Reference Bible, I think, is very helpful and informative. So it kind of describes what this practice was. So in the commentary for this verse 2, Dake explains that this is the first mention of the practice of embalming in the Bible. The process was tedious and expensive. The brain and intestines were removed, and the head and the body were filled with costly spices. After being steeped in natron, which is a term I'm not familiar with, but it sounds to me like it's some kind of preservative material, whether it is liquid or some kind of a balm, like a salve or something like that. That process took 70 days. The body was then washed, wrapped in bandages of linen, covered with gum, and placed in a wooden case. This was not an unusual procedure for the Egyptian culture, but it was kind of unusual for the Hebrew culture, the Israelites. The Israelites typically did not practice embalming. From this time and on into the Second Temple era and so forth, the Jewish people just kind of let nature take its course. Decomposition would, of course, begin right away. So a burial was usually carried out fairly rapidly in Israeli society, certainly within the first 3 days following death. In the New Testament, in John chapter 11, we have the story of the death and the burial of Lazarus, a friend of Yeshua's. And by the time Yeshua arrives at the scene of the tomb of Lazarus, it has been 4 days since he died, and his sisters give testimony that by this time his body will have decomposed and will smell absolutely horrible. But that was kind of the Jewish culture. They just kind of let nature take its course, let decomposition occur. Once pretty much the covering of the body had decomposed and kind of dissolved, I guess you would say, then they would put the bones that remained into what is called an ossuary, uh, which I think is Latin or Greek, and it means a bone box. Um, until that time took place, the body was placed in what was called a sarcophagus, a stone chest, or a coffin. And sarcophagus is also Greek, I believe, and it means flesh eater. That's where decomposition took place. And however long it takes a body to decompose, that's how long the body was left in the sarcophagus and then placed in the ossuary for more permanent storage, I guess. So Yosef commanded his servants, the physicians, to embalm his father, and so they did. Verse 3, 40 days were required for him, and I think Dake told us that the process took that long. Actually, it took 70 days were required for those who were embalmed, and the physicians mourned for him 70 days. So the 70 days is the full course of embalming for the Egyptians. Now, why did Yaakov and later Yosef want to be embalmed? Because they knew, prophetically speaking, that they were going to be in Egypt for quite some time, 215 years or 4 generations. And of course, their bodies would decompose. So they wanted their bodies to be preserved, um, at least to a limited degree, so that those bodies could be transported to the promised land and buried there. So now, when the days of mourning were past, Yosef spoke to the household of Pharaoh, saying, "If now I have found favor in your eyes, please speak in the hearing of Pharaoh, saying, My father made me swear, behold, I am dying. In my grave, behold, I'm dying. In my grave, which I dug for myself in the land of Canaan, there you shall bury me. Now, therefore, please let me go and bury my father, and I will come back." So, a couple of things about these two verses. First of all, when I read through this, I kind of wondered, well, if Joseph was the second most powerful person in Egypt, Pharaoh being the number one, couldn't Joseph have had a kind of an automatic, all you have to do is ask audience with Pharaoh to address this with him directly? And here it says that he spoke to the household of Pharaoh, asking them to relay the message to Pharaoh. And again, Dake gives us some insight, and I don't know where he comes up with this, but it kind of makes sense to me. In his commentary, Finest Dake says he, Joseph, couldn't speak before in the morning because in mourning Egyptians didn't shave, and Yosef was therefore not presentable. So as they were going through this mourning process, um, there was perhaps wearing sackcloth, and Jewish practice was to let the hair be disheveled. But Joseph, of course, is thriving in Egyptian culture, so he was probably clean shaven and dressed like an Egyptian and walked like an Egyptian and so forth. So if he was following this culture of the Egyptians, they didn't shave during mourning time, and so he would not have been presentable to Pharaoh. And I don't know if that's the right answer, but at least it satisfies me. It's some explanation for why Joseph addressed Pharaoh indirectly. The other thing I wanted to talk about here is in the quotation of Yaakov's words, he talks about a grave which he dug. The root of this Hebrew word is kara. That's kaf, resh, and hey, and it means to dig, which is a good gloss for this word. It's a legitimate translation, but if you go a little deeper into it, it can also mean like to hew out of stone, to what? Carve out a niche in the burial place um, in the land of Canaan, which Jacob had in mind. And it sounds like before Jacob left the land of Canaan, he probably knew he was approaching death, so he wanted to prepare the burial site to receive another body, his own, and so he had a niche carved out there. Also, the Hebrew lexicons tell us that in the form where this kara is presented here, it can also mean to purchase or to acquire. And that would be appropriate because this burial site was purchased from Ephron the Hittite a couple of generations earlier by Abraham. But I think it's probably referring to carving out a niche in the cave, which would be to carve it out of stone. This would be similar to the tomb where Yeshua was buried for a very short time, for only 3 days. But he was buried in the tomb of Yosef Haramati, Joseph of Arimathea, who was a very wealthy man and had a burial cave and had a niche prepared for himself. But when Jesus died and Yosef was a follower of his, he was very generous in offering his own tomb to Yeshua. Now, if you ever have a chance to travel to the Holy Land or even look at pictures of the Garden Tomb, you can see imagery of what it looks like inside. If you go in the door where there used to be a rolling stone in front of it, there is kind of a vestibule, and then off to the right, there is a niche that has been carved out for actually 2 people to be buried, probably Joseph on one side and Joseph's wife on the other side. But this is the place where, in all probability, Jesus was buried. Now, for those of you who are familiar with the Holy Land, you may also say that there is a place that the Hebrew the Jewish, the Israeli tourism department claims is, in their opinion, even a better location for the burial of Jesus, and that is within the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And that's possible. That's a possibility. For a variety of reasons, I think the Garden Tomb is a better candidate for the authentic tomb of Jesus. And we could talk for the rest of the video about that, which I'm not going to do. When Jacob says, "I dug this for myself," the reason I'm going into all of this is I don't want you to get the idea that burial in biblical times was kind of like it is now, where if a person dies, you go out to the cemetery and you dig a 6-foot hole in the ground, and then you lower a casket into that hole and cover it over with dirt. That's the way burials are typically done. Some people are buried in, I think it's called a mausoleum, where there are like, I'm going to say like filing drawers. There are openings. There are niches in the mausoleums where you can be buried above ground. In Israel, in modern times, there are also in-ground burials. Many of the burials are very shallow because the bedrock is very near the surface. And so there are like concrete vaults that are built with a concrete lid that goes on. And then, of course, the casket or the body is placed in those concrete things. And they stand above ground. They're, about knee high. And one interesting thing that I've always found is that in Israel, when friends and family members come to the site of a burial, They don't put flowers on the grave, but they put rocks there. And the explanation that I was given by my dear friend Leor from Israel, our tour guide there, is he says people put rocks on the graves because flowers are very temporary, and pretty soon they wither and decay and are just trash and are thrown away. But you put a rock on that grave, unless somebody moves it, it's going to be there pretty much forever, for the long term. And so I kind of like that as kind of a memorial to put a rock on the grave as a reminder that the person who used to occupy this body is going to live on as long as the rocks do. Okay, so yeah, we have Joseph's request, which is a quotation from Jacob that's presented to Pharaoh. And then in verse 6, we have Pharaoh's answer. Pharaoh said, "Go up and bury your father as he made you swear." So Pharaoh gives permission for a very impressive funeral procession to leave Goshen in the land of Egypt and take the body of Jacob to be buried in the promised land. So, verse 7, Yosef went up to bury his father, and with him went all the servants of Pharaoh. So there was an entourage. I would call this like an honor guard from Pharaoh. And I think it was probably very numerous. The elders of his house, I think this is Pharaoh's house. Because Joseph's house isn't that impressive there. I mean, there are only two people. So these are the elders, the very influential people from Egypt, and all the elders of the land of Egypt. So the elders would come from Pharaoh's own house and from all the significant families in Egypt, as well as all the house of Yosef and his brothers and his father's house, only their little ones and their flocks and their herds. They left in the land of Goshen. And so, how many people? 70 or 75 people, 70 some people came from Canaan to live in Egypt. So, most of those people would be part of this funeral procession. If the little children were left there in Goshen, I imagine their moms were left with them. And of course, they left all their livestock there as well. Verse 9, and there they went up, and there went up with him, with Yosef, both chariots and horsemen, and it was a very great gathering. So a very impressive funeral procession. Then they came to the threshing floor of Atad, which is beyond the Jordan, and they mourned there with a great and very solemn lamentation. He observed 7 days of mourning for his father there at the threshing floor of Atad, which is said to be beyond the Jordan. Now, Dake makes a note here. I don't make a big deal out of which side, the east or west of the Jordan River, this place of Atad was. But Dake does, and he makes a good argument here, kind of an interesting argument. Dake says this doesn't mean on the east of Jordan, the Jordan River, in the modern day country kingdom of Jordan. For Hebron is south of Jerusalem, and Jordan is farther on. The phrase beyond Yarden must be understood from the standpoint of where the writer, who's Moses, was at the time of writing Genesis. So Dake is suggesting that Moses was on the east side of the Jordan River, near Mount Nebo, where he died and was buried by God. And that's on the east side. So from Moses' perspective, across the Jordan meant across the Jordan to the west, where Hebron was. So kind of interesting. So the threshing floor of Atad may have been quite close to Hebron, where the burial plot was, where Jacob desired to be buried. Um, let's see, he observed 7 days of mourning for his father. Verse 11. And when the inhabitants of the land, the Canaanites, saw the mourning at the threshing floor of Atad, they said, "This is a deep mourning of the Egyptians." Therefore, they called therefore its name was called Avel Mitzrayim, which is beyond the Jordan, from Moses' perspective. So, in his opinion, west of the Jordan. Yeah, Avel in Hebrew, Aleph, Beit, Lamed, means mourning. And Mitzrayim is the Hebrew word for the land of Egypt. So because these Egyptians, of course, everybody's probably dressed like an Egyptian and walking like an Egyptian in this entourage because they're living in Egypt. Joseph, especially, is the second most powerful man in Egypt, so he would certainly be dressed like an Egyptian. And the people would probably recognize right away that he was the leader of this group that was coming to bury the patriarch. Verse 12, so his sons did for him just as he had commanded them. That is, Yaakov's sons did for him just as he commanded them. For his sons carried him to the land of Canaan and buried him in the cave of the field of Machpelah before Mamre, which in modern times is called, and again, I think in biblical times too, it was called Hebron, which Abraham bought with the field from Ephron the Hittite as a burial place, as property for a burial place. So this is the only land that Abraham owned, and I don't know of any other pieces of real estate that are mentioned as being purchased, with one exception. There are several places in the scriptures where it mentioned that Jacob bought a parcel of ground near Shechem, which would be a significant distance to the north of Hebron. That he bought that land from Hamor and Shechem before his sons killed them all. And that was to be used as a burial plot. And I believe that's the place where Yosef desires to be buried when his time comes. So that may be mentioned here in our text for today. Verse 14, after he had buried his father, Yosef returned to Egypt, and he and his brothers and all who went up with him to bury his father. So after they buried Yaakov there, they returned to Egypt. I suppose it was an opportunity for them to get away from Egypt, but I don't think they wanted to. At this point, the famine is probably over, but they have settled in Egypt, and I think they know that they're going to be there for 4 generations, or 215 total years. So there's, I know Pharaoh did send an entourage with him, lots of powerful and influential people, not to make sure they returned. I think they did that willingly. Of course, that's where all their wives and little ones and their livestock were too. So it was pretty important to them to return. Later on, during the time of the Exodus, the Israelites are going to want to get out of Egypt because their lives are so burdensome. But that's Exodus, and we're in Genesis, chapter 50, verse 15. When Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, perhaps Joseph will hate us and may actually repay us for all the evil which we did to him. This is a pretty sincere confession. They know that the way they treated Joseph by selling him into slavery in Egypt was wrong and evil. But they're concerned about their own welfare now. And I think the thought is going through their minds that maybe Joseph was being kind to them as long as his father was alive. But once his father was dead, he was probably going to seek justice, which would mean severe treatment of his brothers. So they sent messengers to Yosef. Now, in the Hebrew text, it doesn't have the word messengers. So let me go to 16 here. Vayitzav el Yosef. They commanded to Yosef. Yitzav. Oh, it's PL. So it was commanded to Yosef, Lemor, saying, Avicha tziva. It doesn't say anything about messengers here. In our New King James Bible, there's kind of a handy practice by the translators to put in italics words that the translators believe are implied but are not actually in the text. Basically, it just said, it says that it was commanded, they commanded to Joseph, and there's no mention of messengers there. So when you see words in italics, just beware that those words are probably not in the original Hebrew or Greek text. That is not dishonest on the part of the translators. They're doing a good job to help you understand what is probably implied in the text. And I think it probably is. So they sent messengers to Yosef saying, before your father died, he commanded, saying, thus you shall say to Yosef, I beg you, I Yaakov, beg you, please forgive the trespasses of your brothers and their sin, for they did evil to you. Now, please forgive the trespass of the servants of the God of your father. And Yosef wept when they spoke to him. The question, it's a legitimate question, arises. Did Jacob really say this before he died? Or is this something that his brothers were making up, hoping that their claim that Jacob had said this would work well for their well-being? That Joseph wouldn't be mean to them and wouldn't punish them, in accordance with the law and so forth. So did Yaakov really say it? It's possible that it was a made-up story, but the only evidence that we have here is their claim, the brothers' claim, that Yaakov said this before he died. So we have at least 2 or 3 witnesses saying, yes, this did take place. Yaakov did speak these words, and now we're sharing them with you, Yosef. So in the absence of any evidence to the contrary, I'm going to say, yes, Yaakov did say these words. And all the evidence that's available points to it. Now, the credibility of the witnesses, these brothers of Joseph's, it's questionable. But so far, the evidence makes it sound like Yaakov did say that. And Joseph wept when he heard this. Now, why did he weep? Is it because his brothers still didn't trust him to treat them with grace and dignity? Maybe that's why. Maybe it was kind of touching to Yosef that among the last things that his beloved father Yaakov would say to his brothers was, "Please forgive your other your other siblings for the evil they did to you." So Yosef was touched by this, um, uh, and he wept. Then his brothers also went and fell down before his face and said, "Behold, we are your servants." The word is eved, which is a servant, but it's also a slave, which I think is a slave is a little more severe than servants. So they're saying, look, we treated you badly, and now we're not asking you to respect us and treat us as equals. We're willing to be your servants if you'll let us live, if you will forgive us and treat us decently. So Yosef said to them, "Do not be afraid, for am I in the place of God?" This little speech of Yosef's is, I think, one of the most significant messages that was delivered in the Bible. One of the greatest harms that a follower of Yeshua, a believer, can do is to harbor a grudge or to allow unforgiveness to abide in his life. And usually the reason we do that is for legitimate reasons, because people have treated us badly and we don't feel like justice has been done, and we feel like we've been done wrong. And that unforgiveness can lead to, kind of plotting schemes of getting even and things like that. And that is really harmful to anybody, but especially to a believer, because that puts you out of God's will. When Jesus teaches the Lord's Prayer, he says, "Forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us." And then Yeshua adds as kind of a footnote to the Lord's Prayer. He says, "If you forgive the sins of other people, God will forgive you your sins. But if you do not forgive them their sins, then neither will God forgive you your sins." So this attitude of the brothers, um, uh, kind of reflects that they suspect Yosef is harboring this kind of unforgiveness. And it may even indicate that they doubt that he is really following the God of the Bible, the God of Israel, and not living by grace. So Joseph says, "Do not be afraid, for am I in the place of God?" And basically, what Yosef is saying here is that the teaching of the Bible verse that says, "Vengeance is mine, I will repay," says the Lord. So when God says that in the Bible, he's saying to us, don't you seek vengeance. That's my job. I am the judge of all humankind. I will judge, righteously and fairly and so forth. So, we are just kind of supposed to grin and bear it and, take our hardships and the wrongs that have been done to us, and don't let them get us down. Just trust that God will be the judge. And when we think of God being the judge of our enemies, the people who have wronged us and we would like to see justice done, if you think about the harshness of the God of all mankind, and the fairness, certainly the righteousness of his judgments, still you would not want that to happen even to your worst enemy. When you think that the consequence, the sentence for unbelief in Yeshua is eternal separation from God, people never knowing the fellowship and the love and the grace of God, that is something that no one should have to suffer. But they must suffer that because God is a righteous God, a righteous judge. And in order to maintain his character as a fair and righteous judge, he must punish evil. He must send those people to the lake of fire, to Sheol. "But as for you," Joseph continues, "you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good in order to bring it about as it is this day, to save many people alive." I think one of the challenges for every follower of Yeshua, for every believer, is when bad things happen to you, either because some other person has made them happen to you, or you just have an unfortunate um, uh, occurrence in your life. When bad things happen to you, for whatever the reason is, seek out God and see if he will be willing to explain to you why he has allowed this to happen and what good can come out of it. Because oftentimes, if we see a reason for our suffering, it gives it value. And even though it's painful and distasteful and we don't want to be going through it, sometimes if we understand its purpose, it gives dignity to our suffering. And oftentimes it'll change our whole attitude about it. And we'll just say, God, your will be done. Make some good come out of this. The Bible does say all things work together for good to those who love God and are called according to his purposes. That's in Romans chapter 8. And it is true. So when you're going through horrible times, um, while you're going through it, if you can focus on God and be confident that he is going to work this situation for good, oftentimes you'll be looking for the good, and um, and that will make it easier to deal with your hardships. And if you see that good, if you're fortunate enough to live through your torment and to see the good outcome that God has produced, a lot of people would say, "Well, I wouldn't change anything. You know, it was all worth it." And that's the attitude that Joseph took at some point in his ordeal, starting with being despised by his brothers and continuing with being sold into slavery in Egypt. Um, he constantly trusted God and sought to conform his life, his lifestyle, to God's will and God's ways, and he saw manifestations of good. And really, his life in Egypt turned out pretty well. And not only that, but it resulted in the saving of many people alive, not just the family of Joseph, but also the Egyptians and all of the Canaanites and people who lived in the surrounding area that were able to get through the 7 years of famine because of the way God had worked through Joseph. They kind of owed their survival to one man's faith and devotion to God. He goes on, now therefore do not be afraid. I will provide for you and your little ones. And he comforted them and spoke kindly to them. And I think this was coming from his heart. This was not an act he was putting on. This was not religious piety. This was a sincerely felt attitude towards his brothers, and again, a profound devotion to God. So Yosef dwelt in Egypt, he and his father's household, and Yosef lived 110 years. Very lengthy lifespan. Occasionally, people in our day and age live to be 110. These patriarchs are not living nearly as long as the patriarchs of antiquity. Like if you read through Genesis 5 and Genesis 10, that talks about the lifespans of people, Methuselah living 969 years. In the earlier chapters of Genesis, I gave my explanation, my suspicion, I guess, of how these people lived that long. But the lifespan is decreasing as time goes on, and it will get to the point where it's just about the same as it is today. So Yosef saw Ephraim's children to the third generation. So again, we'll go back to our PowerPoint where we looked at the four generations of Moses. Joseph's generation being the first, Ephraim's generation being the second, and then Yosef seeing the third generation. So Yosef saw his own generation, Ephraim's generation, then the children of Ephraim and the grandchildren of Ephraim. That's the four generations. The children of Machir, which would be probably the first son of Ephraim, the son of Manasseh. I'm sorry, the children of Machir, the son of Manasseh. So he saw Ephraim's children to the third and fourth generation. Then Machir is the son of Manasseh, Joseph's other son. They were also brought up on Joseph's knees. And Yosef said to his brethren, I am dying. He says this when he's 110 years old. I'm dying, but God will surely visit you and bring you out of this land of which he swore to Abraham, to Yitzhak, and to Yaakov. So this is a prophecy. Already a prophecy has been given of four generations, 400 years of living in the land of Canaan. And so Joseph now is prophesying on the basis of the prophetic expectation that this family is not going to live in Egypt forever. And then Yosef took an oath from the children of Israel. He asked them to swear to him, basically. God will surely visit you and you shall carry my bones from here. So when Yosef dies, he is planning on being embalmed. He is planning on having his body stored away somewhere until the fourth generation, when the Israelites will leave. And among the treasures, among the things they will take with them when they exodus from Egypt, will be the remains of Yaakov and the remains of Yosef. Now, what about all the other people all the other Israelites who are going to be buried in Egypt? They probably stay there. I think these are the two exceptions to the rule of patriarchs who arranged for their bodies to be embalmed and then taken to the significant burial site in Hebron. Okay, so Yosef died being 110 years old, and they embalmed him. Same word, chanat, to embalm him, the way we had talked about it when we studied this with Yaakov. And he was put in a coffin, an aron. It's not teva, like that kind of an ark. So let me take a step back here. If you look down at the information window at the bottom of the page, the lexicon that we're looking at, which is Strong's lexicon, says that an aron in Hebrew means an ark. An ark is just a wooden box. The wooden box in the story of Noah's Ark is a teva, which is a huge wooden box. Here, it's probably a wooden box that's coffin sized. But this word aron is a very common word, and it has kind of a wide variety of meaning. Everything like from a chest of drawers, that is an aron. Storage boxes, what else would you call it? Like a trunk, it would be an aron. Any kind of a storage box, or a protective container, I guess you would call it. And he was put in a coffin in Egypt. I am going to go ahead and read just the first few verses of Exodus, just to kind of wrap up the study of Genesis. Now, these are the names of the children of Israel who came to Egypt, each man with his household, with Yaakov. Reuben, Shimon, Levi, Yehuda, Issachar, Zvulun, and Binyamin, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, and Asher. So those are the 12 sons. All those who were descendants of Yaakov were 70 persons. I said 70 something before. Persons, for Yosef was in Egypt already. So if you include Joseph, his two sons, and Yaakov, what is that? Does that bring us to 74? So there may be one other person, maybe a grandson. And Yosef died, all his brothers, and all that generation. But the children of Israel were fruitful and increased abundantly and multiplied and grew exceedingly mighty. And the land was filled with them. That would be the land of Goshen. Now there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Yosef. And he said to his people, to the Egyptians, "Look, the people of the children of Israel are more and mightier than we. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply." And it happened, in the event of war, that they also join our enemies and fight against us, and so go up out of the land. Therefore they set taskmasters over them to afflict them with their burdens, and they built for Pharaoh the supply cities of Pithom and Ramses. Because Ramses is mentioned here, it does not mean that he was the Pharaoh of the Exodus or the Pharaoh of Exodus chapter 1. This is probably a reference to the sun god Ra, and this city existed way back in the book of Genesis. But the more they afflicted them, the more they multiplied and grew, and they were in dread of the children of Israel. The Egyptians were. So the Egyptians made the children of Israel serve with rigor, and they made their lives bitter with hard bondage in mortar and brick and all manner of service, all their service for them, which they made to serve. And then the king of Egypt spoke to the Hebrew midwives, of whom the name of one was Shiphrah, and the name of the other Puah. And he said, when you do the duties of the midwife for the Hebrew women and see them on their birth stools, just getting ready to deliver, if it is a son, then you shall kill him. But if it is a daughter, then you shall let him live. But the midwives feared God and did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but saved the male children alive. They were moral people, and they are lauded in the Bible. These midwives are. So the king of Egypt called for the midwives and said to them, why have you done this thing and saved the male children alive? And the midwives said to Pharaoh, because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, for they are lively and give birth before the midwives come to them, before the midwives even get there. And some Bible scholars have said these midwives lied, so they were not as moral as the Bible wants to make them. But maybe the Hebrew women were like that. They knew that their male children were under a death sentence, so they probably gave birth in secret before they even called the midwives. Therefore, God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and grew very mightily. And so it was because the midwives feared God that he provided households for them, for the midwives. So Pharaoh commanded all his people, saying, every son who is born you shall cast into the river, and every daughter you shall save alive. And a man of the house of Levi went and took a wife, a daughter of Levi. This is Amram and Yocheved, although they are not named here. We do know their names from other Bible passages and from history, like Josephus. So the woman conceived and bore a son, and when she saw that he was a beautiful child, she hid him for 3 months. When she could no longer hide him, she took him, put him in an ark, a tavat, and that is the Hebrew word that's used for Noah's Ark, of bulrushes, and he daubed it with and she daubed it with asphalt and pitch and put the child in the reeds, and so on. And thus begins the story of Moses. So we see how after after the days of Yosef, things kind of went south for the Hebrews over the generations, probably gradually. That what we've just shared from the book of Exodus sets the stage for why God was concerned about the treatment of his people, and he arranged to keep his promise to use Moshe as his leader and to bring them back to the promised land. And in doing so, he reveals himself not only as a God who makes promises, but as a God who keeps promises. One of the things that we learn about the sacred name of God is that it teaches that Yahweh, the sacred name of God, is a covenant-keeping God. Yes, he makes covenants, but he keeps them. And so for all these generations of the patriarchs, they had the giving of a covenant, but they had not seen the fulfillment of it. And Hebrews chapter 11 has a lot to say about that. But in Genesis, God himself says, I revealed myself to Abraham, Yitzhak, and Yaakov as El Shaddai, God Almighty, the covenant maker. And of course, all these patriarchs lived on the basis of faith expectation that God would eventually keep his promises. But in the book of Exodus, chapter 3 and chapter 6, God reveals himself to Moshe by his name Yahweh, the sacred name of God, and the text of those scriptures explains that he was about to keep the covenant with them and take them out of Egypt, redeem them from their bondage, take them to the promised land, and keep his promise and give them that land. So with that, we conclude our study of the book of Genesis. I'm not sure what we'll do next. I have a couple of different ideas. I think we will go back to some New Testament studies of New Testament books, but I've also got some Hebrew language things that are kind of running through my mind. So we'll see what we do. Let me give you the priestly blessing from Numbers chapter 6. Yivarechecha Yahweh vayishmarecha, Ya'er Yahweh panav elecha vayuchanecha, Isa Yahweh panav elecha vayasem lecha shalom. And that means the Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance on you and give you peace. For those of you who have joined me through all 50 videos of Genesis, thanks so much for doing that. Hope it's been a blessing to you. And we will see you soon with some different, new and different videos.